In the sleepy town of Oakfield, Texas, where the sun always seemed to set with a touch of gold, the residents had no idea that their seemingly peaceful lives were about to be torn apart. The heart of the town was its church, Grace Baptist Church, a grand building that stood tall against the town's modest backdrop. The church was led by Pastor Samuel Harper, a man admired for his dedication and righteousness. His deep voice echoed through the sanctuary every Sunday, and his sermons were filled with wisdom and compassion. But behind the pulpit, Pastor Harper was hiding a secret that was about to unravel everything. It all started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Pastor Harper had been spending more time at the church lately, preparing for the upcoming Easter service. His wife, Amanda Harper, often ran errands and took care of their two children. Pastor Samuel had become absorbed in his work, and the tension in their marriage had been building for some time. He was aware of Amanda's increasing distance, but he couldn't quite pinpoint why. On that fateful Tuesday, he had decided to surprise her. He returned home earlier than expected, hoping to have a quiet afternoon together. But what he found that day would haunt him forever. As he stepped into their home, he heard muffled voices coming from their bedroom. At first, he thought it was a conversation on the phone, but as he crept closer to the door, he froze. The voices he heard were not on the phone. They were real, and they were not alone. Peering through the cracked door, he saw Amanda, his wife, in the arms of another man. The man was none other than Robert Owens, a respected member of their congregation. Pastor Samuel had always thought of Robert as a friend, a pillar of the church, someone he could trust. But now, as he watched the betrayal unfold before his eyes, he realized that nothing he knew about Robert or his own wife was true. The room spun around him, and for a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. His heart raced, and a wave of anger and hurt flooded his chest. He stood there motionless, for what seemed like an eternity, his mind struggling to process the sight before him. Then a thought crossed his mind, a cold, vengeful thought. This was no ordinary betrayal. Robert wasn't just another man. He was a man who had sat under his teachings for years, someone who had professed faith and loyalty to the Lord. Amanda, his wife, had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. And now, in the most public way imaginable, he would make them pay. Without making a sound, Pastor Harper slipped out of the house, his mind already working through a plan. His phone was in his hand before he even realized it. He opened the camera app and recorded the final moments, the undeniable evidence of his wife's infidelity. His breath was shallow as he captured every painful second. It was all so simple in his mind. He would show the world what Amanda had done, let the congregation see the truth. But there was more to it. He wanted revenge, not just for the betrayal of his marriage, but for the betrayal of his trust in the church. Later that evening, Pastor Harper walked into the church, his phone still clutched tightly in his hand. The building was empty save for a few lingering church members, but the sanctuary was still, as if it were waiting for something big. He couldn't wait. He would show the congregation the video. The evidence would be irrefutable. They would see the truth. They would know that their trusted member, Robert Owens, had not only violated his marriage vows but had also broken the sacred trust of the church. He approached the pulpit, the heavy doors of the church creaking open as he entered. The video was queued up on his phone, ready to play for the entire congregation. He would expose them both, Amanda and Robert. They would be humiliated, and maybe, just maybe, it would bring him some peace. The following Sunday, Pastor Samuel stood before his congregation, his face tight with anger and hurt. He could see the curious eyes of the members waiting for the service to begin. But there was no prayer today, no scripture reading, no hymns. Today, the only thing he had to offer them was the painful truth. As the room fell silent, he pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing the intimate betrayal that had shattered his world. The faces in the crowd changed from curiosity to shock, then to confusion, and finally to disbelief. Pastor Harper stood still, watching as the video played, knowing that his life and the lives of Amanda and Robert would never be the same again. The video had barely finished playing when the stunned silence in Grace Baptist Church turned into a frenzy of hushed conversations. Some members were still in shock, their faces frozen in disbelief as they processed the shocking images they had just witnessed. Others were already whispering among themselves, questioning the morality of what they had seen. The air was thick with a tension that no one had expected. Pastor Samuel Harper stood at the pulpit, his face etched with raw emotion. The anger, the humiliation, the hurt, he could feel it all boiling inside him. But there was something more, a twisted sense of vindication. He had shown them the truth, exposed the sins that had been hidden behind the walls of his own home. Now, everyone knew what Amanda, his wife, had done. And Robert Owens, the pillar of the community, had been laid bare for all to see. But as the video played out, something else was happening. People were looking at him, some with pity, others with judgment. He had wanted them to see the truth, but now he realized that the truth was more complicated than he had imagined. The service was a disaster. People began to leave one by one, their faces clouded with confusion. A few members tried to approach Pastor Samuel after the service ended, but he dismissed them quickly, too angry and hurt to speak. He couldn't bear the thought of having another conversation with anyone in the church. The damage had been done, and he wasn't sure if he could fix it. Amanda had left the church in a hurry, not waiting for her husband, not even bothering to explain herself. She had disappeared, just like Robert Owens. Samuel couldn't help but feel a pang of betrayal that cut deeper than the humiliation of the video itself. Amanda had always been there for him, or so he thought. Now she was gone, and so was his trust in everything he had built. As the hours passed, the phone calls began. Some were from friends, some from concerned church members, and some from people who seemed to have only one thing on their minds: gossip. The local news stations had already caught wind of the scandal. Headlines blared across the town. Pastor's wife caught an affair with church member. Scandal rocks Oakfield. The whole town was talking about it. From the coffee shops to the grocery store, everyone seemed to have an opinion about the pastor, his wife, and their crumbling marriage. But in the midst of all the chaos, there was one person who remained calm: Detective Sarah Lawson. Sarah had been a seasoned investigator with the Oakfield Police Department for over a decade. She had seen her fair share of church-related scandals, embezzlement, fraud, and even drug abuse among congregation members. But nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing had prepared her for a pastor caught in a web of deceit, publicly exposing his own family's betrayal. Her first steps were to gather the evidence. She had seen the video that everyone was talking about, but she knew that the truth wouldn't be found in the footage alone. There was more to this story, and she intended to find it. The next day, she visited Grace Baptist Church. The building stood as it always had, imposing and proud, but Sarah could sense the change in the air. The doors were locked, but the secretary let her in after a brief exchange. She walked through the empty sanctuary, feeling the weight of the silence. This place, once filled with the sound of hymns and prayers, now felt hollow. Detective Lawson knew the first person she needed to speak to was Pastor Samuel. She found him sitting alone in his office, staring out of the window, lost in thought. His hands were clasped together tightly, as if he were holding on to something, perhaps his last shred of dignity. "Pastor Harper," she began, breaking the silence, "I need to ask you a few questions." He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he slowly rose from his chair and faced her, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Detective Lawson, I know why you're here," he said quietly, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I know what everyone is saying about me. I know what they think." "I'm not here to judge you, Pastor," Sarah replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm here to find the truth. What happened, and how did we get to this point?" Samuel let out a long breath and sank back into his chair. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew that the detective had every right to know what had happened. It's all a blur," he began, rubbing his temples. "I never thought this would happen. Amanda, she's my wife, and I loved her with everything I had. Robert, I trusted him. He was like a brother to me, a fellow servant of the Lord. But it's all falling apart. I walked in on them that day, and everything changed." Detective Lawson nodded, taking notes as he spoke. She had heard bits and pieces of the story from the gossip circulating Oakfield, but hearing it directly from the pastor was different. There was pain in his voice, a depth of sorrow that couldn't be faked. I filmed them, Pastor Harper continued, his voice shaking. I didn't know what else to do. The video, when I played it in front of the congregation, I thought they would understand my pain. I thought it would show them the truth, but now, I don't know if it was the right choice. I don't know what to think anymore. Sarah's expression softened. She had seen the devastation in the pastor's eyes, but she couldn't allow herself to get too emotionally involved. She had a job to do. Did you contact Amanda after the service? She asked, her voice steady. Number. She left the church immediately. I haven't spoken to her since, Samuel said, his eyes hollow with regret. I don't even know where she is. I can't believe she'd do this to me. And Robert Owens, Sarah pressed. Where is he? No one has seen him since the service ended. Robert, I don't know. He didn't come back to the church after the video played. I assumed he left town, but I haven't heard from him either. Detective Lawson made a mental note to follow up on Robert Owens. Pastor Harper's story was compelling, but something didn't sit right with her. There was too much anger, too much hurt for it to be just a simple act of betrayal. There had to be more to it, a deeper layer to the truth. I'll need to speak with Amanda and Robert, she said, rising from her chair. I'll also need to get the video from you for evidence. Pastor Harper nodded absently, his eyes still distant. I understand, he muttered, his voice barely audible. As Sarah left the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else hidden in the darkness of this case. Pastor Harper's words didn't entirely match the behavior she had witnessed. His pain was real, but so was his anger. She would have to dig deeper. She would find out the truth, even if it meant uncovering secrets no one wanted to hear. The town of Oakfield was just beginning to realize the magnitude of what had happened, and Detective Lawson had just begun her search for answers. The following days in Oakfield were tense, and the aftermath of the scandal continued to ripple through the small town. The once tightly knit community had splintered, with the gossip swirling faster than ever. The news outlets had picked up the story, and even the most mundane of local happenings seemed to be overshadowed by the affair between Pastor Samuel Harper's wife, Amanda, and Robert Owens. The quiet streets were now filled with whispered conversations, furtive glances, and a general sense of disarray. Detective Sarah Lawson had barely slept since the incident. As a seasoned investigator, she had learned not to get caught up in the emotions surrounding cases. But this one was different. There was something about the way Pastor Samuel had confessed, the way he held himself, that made Sarah question whether he was entirely innocent. The story, as he told it, was just the tip of the iceberg, and she was determined to find out what lay beneath the surface. She started by retracing the steps of the main players involved: Pastor Samuel, Amanda, and Robert. Samuel had been the first to speak, and his account had been an emotional outpouring of grief. But Sarah needed more than just one side of the story. She needed the truth, the raw, unfiltered facts. That morning, she decided to visit Robert Owens' house. The town was on edge and rumors were flying. Everyone in Oakfield knew Robert as a respectable businessman, a successful real estate agent who had attended Grace Baptist Church for years. No one could fathom that he would be capable of such betrayal, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. She arrived at Robert's house, a modest but well-kept home on the outskirts of town. The tall hedges and thick trees surrounding the property made it feel secluded, almost isolated. As she approached the front door, her eyes scanned the yard. Everything appeared normal on the surface. No signs of distress, no broken windows, no indication that the owner had fled. But she had been trained to notice the details that others missed. She rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, a man appeared at the door. He was taller than she expected, with a hard jawline and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. His face was pale, and his eyes were tired. He wasn't the same confident Robert Owens that people knew from church. Detective Lawson, she introduced herself, showing him her badge. I'd like to speak with you about what happened at the church on Sunday. Robert looked wary, glancing over his shoulder as if he were uncertain whether to let her in. After a long pause, he stepped aside and allowed her entry. Please come in, he said in a quiet voice, his words heavy with reluctance. Sarah stepped inside, noting the almost sterile cleanliness of the interior. It looked like the home of a man who took pride in keeping up appearances, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Robert led her into the living room and offered her a seat, though he remained standing. "I don't know what you expect to hear, Detective," Robert began, his voice shaky. "I don't know how it all happened. I don't know what came over me. I never meant for it to go this far." "Let's take it from the beginning," Sarah suggested, her tone calm but firm. "You were involved in an affair with Amanda Harper, and it was exposed in front of the entire congregation. But why? What were you thinking?" Robert's eyes shifted uncomfortably and he rubbed his forehead. It was clear that he was struggling to put his thoughts into words. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he finally said. "I was close to Samuel. We've known each other for years. He's like a brother to me. And Amanda, well, we've been friends too. It just happened. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we were involved." He let out a long breath, looking up at Sarah with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. "I know it was wrong, but I didn't plan it. It wasn't something I was proud of." "Did you think Samuel would never find out?" Sarah asked, narrowing her eyes. "How could you risk everything, your relationship with him, with the church, your marriage, just for a fling?" "I don't know," Robert muttered. "At first it didn't feel like that. It was just something that happened. But when we were caught, well, things went downhill fast. After the video was played, I couldn't face anyone. I thought about leaving Oakfield altogether, but then I realized I had to face the consequences. And when I tried to go back to the church, I couldn't." Samuel was beyond angry. He had every right to be. I had betrayed him, his trust. I couldn't handle the shame. "Where did you go after the church service ended?" Sarah pressed, noticing that Robert's story was somewhat vague. Robert hesitated. "I didn't go far. I just needed to be alone. I didn't want to face anyone. Not Samuel, not anyone at church." "Did you ever talk to Amanda after Sunday?" Sarah asked. "No," Robert said quickly. "I haven't heard from her. I don't even know where she is." Something in his words didn't sit right with Sarah. The panic in Robert's voice, the way he seemed to avoid eye contact when discussing Amanda's whereabouts, made her suspicious. Robert claimed he didn't know where Amanda was. But did he? Was it possible that he had been involved in more than just an affair? "Robert, you don't seem like the kind of man who would just disappear like this. You've got a family, a reputation. Why run?" Sarah asked bluntly. Robert's expression faltered, and he sighed heavily. "I'm not running from my responsibilities, Detective. But I think you're right. There's more to this than just a bad decision. I... I need time to think. I'm not ready to talk about everything yet." Sarah studied him for a moment, watching the guilt cloud his features. She could tell that he wasn't telling her everything, but for now she didn't press further. There were other ways to get the information she needed. "All right, Robert," she said, standing up. "I'll let you go for now, but I may need to come back and ask more questions. In the meantime, I suggest you reach out to Amanda. If you know where she is, you need to tell me. This is bigger than just an affair. There are too many unanswered questions." As Sarah left Robert's house, her mind was racing. His words had left more questions than answers, and she was starting to feel like she was chasing a puzzle with missing pieces. Why had Robert been so evasive? Why hadn't he tried harder to reach out to Amanda? Was it because he knew something he wasn't ready to share? Back at the Oakfield Police Department, Sarah sat down at her desk and went over the information she had gathered. Pastor Samuel's emotional outburst, Robert's cryptic statements, and Amanda's sudden disappearance. None of it made sense. It was as if everyone had something to hide. And then there was the video, the footage that had caused the scandal and destroyed the trust between Samuel, Amanda, and Robert. There was more to that video than met the eye. Sarah knew she had to examine it carefully, analyze every frame, because she was starting to believe there was more at play here than just infidelity. With a deep sigh, Sarah picked up the phone and called the tech team. She needed to have that video analyzed, every detail, every frame, every shadow. She had a feeling that the truth was hidden within those moments. As she hung up the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just beginning to unravel something much darker than a simple affair. She had only scratched the surface, and there was more waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, the sun rose over Oakfield, casting long shadows on the streets of the small town. The cool February air carried a faint hint of the snow that had recently fallen, But the chill was not the only thing that seemed to freeze the town. The fallout from Pastor Samuel Harper's scandalous public shaming of his wife, Amanda, and Robert Owens continued to ripple through the community like a stone dropped in a pond. Each day the gossip grew louder, the whispers grew sharper, and the reality of what had transpired became more and more difficult to ignore. Detective Sarah Lawson sat at her desk in the Oakfield Police Department, sorting through the growing mountain of evidence that had piled up over the past few days. She had met with Robert Owens, spoken to Pastor Samuel, and even reached out to some of the church members who were willing to talk. But each conversation had left her with more questions than answers. The pieces of the puzzle didn't seem to fit, and the truth, elusive as ever, refused to reveal itself. Her phone rang, breaking the silence in the small office. It was Officer Jim Harris, the department's tech specialist. "Detective Lawson?" Jim's voice crackled through the receiver. "Yes, Jim. What do you have for me?" Sarah replied, sitting up straighter in her chair, her fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. "I've finished analyzing the video footage from the church service," Jim said, his tone businesslike. "There's something you need to see." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had known that the video, which had been played in front of the entire congregation, was a key element in the investigation, but now she felt the weight of its significance more than ever. She stood up and grabbed her coat, ready to head to the station's tech lab. When she arrived, Jim was already at his computer waiting for her. The dim glow of the screen highlighted the tired look on his face. He had been up all night working on the footage. "I've gone over every frame," Jim said, motioning for Sarah to sit beside him. He clicked a few buttons and the video of the church service appeared on the screen. The grainy footage started playing. The familiar scene of the congregation gathered, the hush falling over the crowd, and then the moment when Pastor Samuel Harper stepped up to the pulpit and pressed play. Sarah watched intently as the video unfolded. The camera zoomed in on the two figures caught in the act, their faces obscured by shadows at first, but slowly becoming clearer. Amanda, Pastor Samuel's wife, was in the church's office, caught in a compromising position with Robert Owens. The video seemed to focus on the two of them for several long moments, their actions beyond the reach of anyone who might walk in. But then something else caught Sarah's eye. "Stop it right there," she said, pointing at the screen. Jim paused the footage. The image froze on a split second just before the camera's angle shifted. A subtle detail that hadn't stood out before was now crystal clear. A figure standing just outside the doorframe of the office, partially hidden by the door itself. "I didn't see that before," Jim muttered. "Who's that?" Sarah leaned in closer, her mind racing. The figure was a man, his silhouette blurred but distinct enough to make out. He wasn't just a shadow. He was standing deliberately at the door, watching, but not entering. "Could this be someone else from the church?" Sarah asked, her voice low. Jim frowned. "I can run a facial recognition analysis, but I'm betting this is no random passerby. Someone knew something was happening." Sarah's gut tightened. This could be the break she needed, the missing piece of the puzzle. The mystery figure in the doorway wasn't just a bystander. He was someone who had been deliberately hiding, watching the scene unfold, yet making no attempt to stop it. "Get me a full facial scan," she ordered. "I want to know who that man is." As Jim worked on processing the image, Sarah's thoughts swirled around the implications of what they had just discovered. She had suspected for a while now that something wasn't right. The affair between Amanda and Robert Owens, while shocking, felt like the least of the drama. There was something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface of this scandal. But who was the man in the doorway? And what role did he play in the drama that had unfolded in the church? While Jim ran the facial scan, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. It was time to visit Amanda's family. Amanda Harper's parents lived on a quiet street on the outskirts of Oakfield, a few miles away from the church. The house was modest but well kept. Sarah had heard through the grapevine that Amanda had grown up in Oakfield before moving away briefly after marrying Samuel. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed a car parked out front, one that she recognized. It was Amanda's. Amanda's mother, Karen, opened the door almost immediately. She had the tired, worn expression of someone who hadn't slept much in the past few days. "Detective Lawson," Karen greeted her, her voice shaky. "Please come in." I wasn't expecting company, but she cut herself off, clearly overwhelmed. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Harper, Sarah said, her tone gentle but firm. I need to speak to Amanda. Is she here? Karen's face fell. She's been here. She's been staying with us since the incident at the church. But, but she's not doing well. She's not answering her phone. She's just... Her voice cracked, and she stepped back from the door, gesturing for Sarah to come inside. Sarah followed Karen into the living room, where Amanda was sitting on the couch. She was hunched over, staring at the floor, her face pale and tired. It was clear that the past few days had taken a toll on her. Her eyes were red, and her hands were trembling slightly. When she looked up and saw Sarah, her expression hardened. I'm not talking to anyone, Amanda said sharply. I don't care what you want from me. Amanda, I understand that you're going through a lot right now, Sarah said quietly, sitting down across from her. But I need answers. What happened between you and Robert Owens? You need to tell me everything. Amanda closed her eyes for a long moment before speaking in a low, almost inaudible voice. I didn't want it to happen, but it did, and I don't know how to fix any of it. Sarah sat quietly, letting Amanda gather her thoughts. The raw emotion in her voice, the guilt, the regret, it was all too real. But Sarah knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down. There were pieces missing in this story, and Amanda held some of the answers. Why did you do it, Amanda? Sarah asked gently. Why did you choose Robert over your marriage? Over everything? Amanda looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow. It wasn't planned. It was never supposed to be this way. But somewhere along the way, I felt invisible. Samuel was always so focused on the church, on everyone else. I needed attention. I needed someone to see me. Amanda's voice wavered, and she swallowed hard. Robert, he listened to me. He saw me. He was there for me when I needed him. Sarah's heart sank. She had heard this before. Stories of people who had turned to others in moments of vulnerability. But what happened next was the part that didn't make sense. Did you ever think about the consequences of your actions? Sarah asked. Amanda's face twisted with guilt. I didn't think. I couldn't think. And now look where we are. Amanda looked down again, tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't the only one in turmoil. I need to know where Robert is, Amanda. We've spoken to him, but he's not being forthcoming. You're the only one who can help me find him. Amanda hesitated for a long moment before whispering, I don't know where he is, but I'm scared. He's gone, Sarah. I don't think he's coming back. Before Sarah could press further, Amanda's phone buzzed. She picked it up without looking at the screen, and her eyes widened. It's him, she whispered, her voice trembling. Who? Sarah asked urgently. A man, Amanda said, her breath catching in her throat. The one who saw us that day. The one who filmed us. He's threatening to tell everyone. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The mystery figure in the video, the man watching from the doorway, was real. And now he was pulling the strings. The tension in the air seemed to suffocate Sarah as she processed Amanda's words. The mysterious man in the video wasn't just an observer. He was an active player in this unfolding drama. The implications of that were vast, and as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, Sarah realized that she had stumbled upon something far more complicated than a simple affair. Amanda, Sarah said, her voice steady but urgent, I need you to think carefully. Who is this man? Where is he now? Amanda's hands shook as she clutched the phone in her lap, the screen now dark. She stared at it, as if willing it to provide her with some kind of clue. I don't know who he is, Amanda whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I've never seen him before. He wasn't part of the congregation. He wasn't someone I recognized from the church. He was just there. But you must have seen something, anything that might help, Sarah pressed, leaning forward. Did he say anything to you? Was there a way you could tell who he was? Amanda shook her head, tears spilling down her face. I don't know, Detective. I don't remember. All I remember is his eyes, his cold eyes, and then it was too late. I don't know where he went. I don't know if he's still watching me. Sarah felt a chill race down her spine. The fear in Amanda's voice was genuine, but it was also laced with guilt and regret. Amanda wasn't the only victim in this situation, but she had played a significant role in how it had all unraveled. "I'm going to find this man," Sarah said firmly. "I need you to stay here and not talk to anyone. If you hear from him again, I want to know immediately." Amanda nodded, barely able to speak through her sobs. Sarah gave her one last reassuring glance before turning and heading for the door. She couldn't waste any time. If this man had footage, if he had recorded what happened in that office, he held a powerful weapon, one that could destroy more than just the reputations of those involved. And now he was threatening to expose everything. But why? What was his motive? Back at the Oakfield Police Department, Sarah wasted no time reaching out to her team. They had to track down this man, figure out who he was, and uncover his connection to the entire situation. The clock was ticking, and with each passing minute, the danger of the man's threats becoming a reality grew. She walked into the tech room, where Jim had been working tirelessly on the video footage. He was hunched over his computer, eyes glued to the screen, but when he saw Sarah approach, he immediately straightened up. "You got something?" Sarah asked, her voice urgent. Jim nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I ran a full facial recognition scan on the mystery man in the doorway. We got a hit." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Who is he?" Jim's fingers paused on the keys as he pulled up an image of the man from the video. The grainy frame showed the figure's face more clearly now. Sharp features, a dark coat, and eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera. Jim zoomed in on the image and brought up the results. "This is Kyle Jennings," Jim said, his voice betraying a mixture of surprise and confusion. "He's not from Oakfield. He's a drifter, or at least he was. There's not much about him, but I found some older records. He's been in and out of several towns across the state, a few charges here and there. Nothing major. He's not a criminal mastermind, but he's got a history of small-time offenses. Nothing that would tie him to Oakfield specifically, though." "Kyle Jennings," Sarah repeated under her breath, processing the information. "What's his connection to this?" Jim didn't have the answer yet, but he was already digging deeper. "I'm pulling up more information on him. There might be something we missed." Sarah wasn't about to wait around for Jim to find more. She had a lead, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Kyle Jennings might have been a drifter with a history of minor offenses, but if he had video footage of Amanda and Robert, he was much more dangerous than he seemed. "Keep looking, Jim," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I'm going to talk to Pastor Samuel. We need to know if he recognized this guy." Pastor Samuel Harper had remained mostly silent since the incident at church, and the normally composed pastor had become a shadow of his former self. Sarah arrived at his home, the place where the once confident man of God had lived a quiet, seemingly perfect life. The house was large, tucked away on a well-manicured property at the edge of Oakfield. The door opened to reveal Pastor Samuel standing there, his face drawn and tired. He seemed smaller now, as though the weight of everything that had happened had taken a physical toll on him. "Detective Lawson," he greeted her in a low voice. "What brings you here?" "I need to ask you about something, Pastor," Sarah said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I need to know if you recognize this man." She pulled out a photo of Kyle Jennings, the image from the video that Jim had unearthed. She handed it to Samuel, watching closely for his reaction. His eyes scanned the photo, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, just the briefest hesitation, before he shook his head. "I've never seen him before," Samuel said firmly, though his voice faltered slightly. "I don't know who this is." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "You've been involved with this community for years. You must know everyone who comes and goes. This man was at your church, in your office, during one of the most traumatic moments of your life. You're telling me you don't recognize him?" Samuel's expression twisted, the guilt and shame evident on his face. He seemed to struggle with his own thoughts, as though there was something he was keeping back. "I don't know who he is," he repeated, his voice growing more insistent. "But I'm telling you, Detective, he wasn't supposed to be there." Sarah studied him for a moment, her suspicion growing. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his words seemed to dance around the truth, that didn't sit right with her. She had learned to trust her instincts, And right now, her instincts were telling her that Samuel was hiding something. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice cold and calculated. "You're saying someone just walked into your office without anyone noticing?" Samuel sighed deeply, looking away. "I don't know how he got in," he said, his voice trailing off. "But I do know one thing for sure. He had a plan. And that plan was to destroy me." The more Sarah spoke to Pastor Samuel, the more she realized that he was still hiding something crucial, something that could unlock the entire case. Kyle Jennings wasn't just a random man who had filmed the affair. He was involved in something far more sinister. As Sarah left Samuel's house, her mind raced. Jennings was no stranger to Oakfield, and he had ties to someone who was intent on making sure the video got out. It was becoming increasingly clear that there were multiple players involved, and Samuel Harper's story didn't add up. The truth was slipping further away, but Sarah was determined to find it. The question now was not just about what happened between Amanda and Robert. It was about how deep the conspiracy ran and how far Jennings was willing to go to tear everything apart. Sarah's next move was clear. She needed to find Kyle Jennings before he could do any more damage. And she was beginning to suspect that the man was far closer to the town's secrets than anyone had ever realized. The investigation had reached a tipping point. As Sarah sat at her desk, the evening light dimming outside the police department windows, she felt the weight of the case bearing down on her more than ever. Every lead seemed to turn into another dead end, and yet the threads of the case were slowly beginning to weave together into something much larger than she had anticipated. Samuel Harper's strange behavior had only deepened Sarah's suspicions. The way he avoided directly answering her questions, the way his story about the mysterious man in the church office didn't quite add up. It was as though he were deliberately withholding something crucial. And now Amanda's statement about the man filming them, paired with the footage Jim had uncovered, painted an even more disturbing picture. Pastor Harper's involvement in the events seemed like more than just a bystander. He had been at the center of it, and now with the arrival of Kyle Jennings, the plot had thickened. Sarah had one goal now. She needed to track down Kyle Jennings. She was starting to realize that Jennings wasn't just a passerby in the unfolding drama. He had something more to gain from all of this than just recording a scandalous video. He was a part of something much bigger, a cog in a machine she hadn't fully seen yet. But what? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the desk. It was Jim. "Detective, you need to come to the lab right now. I found something that could change everything." Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, every step bringing her closer to what might be the breakthrough she so desperately needed. When Sarah arrived at the tech room, Jim was already there, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. His expression was tense, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard as if he had just discovered something monumental. "I ran a deep dive into Kyle Jennings's history," Jim said without looking up, "and I think we've been looking at this all wrong. Jennings isn't just a drifter with a few minor offenses. He's connected to a larger group, a group that has been involved in several high-profile blackmail schemes in neighboring towns." Sarah's heart sank. "How did you find that out?" "I found an old police report from a case in Marshall County, a town about 50 miles away. In it, a man named Kyle Jennings was linked to a series of extortions involving local businesses and wealthy individuals. His MO was always the same. He would film or photograph people in compromising situations, then use the material to extort money or favors." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the information. Blackmail. It all suddenly made sense. Jennings hadn't been interested in just recording a video to embarrass a couple in Oakfield. His goal had been something far more calculated. He was looking for leverage, and Oakfield was the perfect place to execute his scheme. "So this wasn't just about Amanda and Robert," Sarah said, piecing the puzzle together. "Jennings wasn't just a voyeur. He's been doing this for years, finding people's secrets and exploiting them for profit." Jim nodded grimly. "Exactly. And what's even worse is that the group he's connected to, they've moved on from simple extortion to something more dangerous. They're connected to organized crime, detective. This isn't just some small-time scheme anymore. Jennings is part of something bigger." Sarah felt a chill run through her. The investigation had just taken a dark turn. What began as a scandal involving a pastor, his wife, and a member of the congregation had spiraled into something far more dangerous. Organized crime, blackmail. And it was all unfolding in her small town. With new information in hand, Sarah knew she had to shift her approach. Jennings was no longer just a rogue figure who had stumbled into the church that day. He was part of a criminal network that had likely infiltrated Oakfield for years. The blackmail of Amanda and Robert was just one piece of a much larger game. But before she could plan her next move, she needed to speak with Samuel Harper again. He was the key to understanding how Jennings had gotten involved with Oakfield. He had known something, whether he was willing to admit it or not. She drove back to the Harper residence, the sun now fully set, and the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. When she arrived at the door, Pastor Samuel greeted her with a mixture of apprehension and exhaustion. "Detective Lawson," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't expect you to come back." "I need answers, Pastor," Sarah said firmly. "You're hiding something, and I think you know more about Kyle Jennings than you're letting on." Samuel winced at the mention of Jennings' name. His body language shifted as if he were preparing himself for something difficult. "I already told you everything I know," he said, stepping back from the door. "I don't have anything more to add." But Sarah could see the cracks in his composure. She knew he was lying, and she knew it wasn't just about the affair between his wife and Robert Owens anymore. There was more at stake now, much more. "I don't think you're being honest with me, Pastor," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I've uncovered a lot more about Jennings, and I know you're involved in something bigger than you're letting on. This isn't just about blackmailing your wife. This is about organized crime, and I think you're at the center of it." Samuel's face paled. For the first time, the mask of the confident man of God seemed to slip. His eyes darted nervously, and he began to pace in the living room. "Detective," he said, his voice breaking, "I never wanted this to happen. I just—" He stopped and rubbed his temples, trying to collect his thoughts. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Samuel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his admission. "I didn't know how deep it went. When Kyle Jennings showed up, I thought it was just a man with a camera, someone trying to make a quick buck. But then he started threatening me. He knew things about my past, things no one else should know. He said he had information about me, about my wife, about things I'd done that I couldn't take back." Sarah's mind was spinning. Pastor Samuel had always been a man of faith, but his desperation was beginning to paint a different picture. "What did you do, Pastor?" "I tried to pay him off at first," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't enough. He said he wanted more. He wanted power. He wanted control. And the more I tried to resist, the more he dug into my life. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. He had information on people in the church, on business owners, on people with money. And he knew how to use that information to get what he wanted." Sarah was stunned. The web of deceit had grown even larger than she had imagined. Pastor Samuel wasn't just the victim in this situation. He had been complicit in something far darker. "And you allowed this to happen?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "You allowed this man to exploit the people in your congregation for your own gain?" Samuel's face contorted with guilt. "I never wanted it to go this far, but Jennings, he had me in a corner. And once he realized how much power he had over me, he didn't stop. He kept threatening me, threatening my family. And then when the affair happened, when I found out about Amanda and Robert, I was already too far gone." His words were a jumbled mess of guilt and regret, but Sarah had heard enough. She wasn't about to let this man, a supposed man of God, continue to hide behind his lies. He had allowed this situation to spiral out of control, and now people were paying the price. "I don't care about your excuses, Pastor," Sarah said, her tone sharp. "What I need from you now is the truth. Where is Kyle Jennings? What is he planning next?" Samuel's shoulders slumped, the weight of his choices finally becoming clear. He knew that no matter how much he tried to run from it, the truth had caught up with him, and the consequences of his actions were only just beginning. "He's gone," Samuel whispered. "I don't know where he is, but I know he's not done. He's coming after everyone who's ever crossed him. and now he's going to make sure that none of us get away. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Jennings wasn't just out for revenge against Pastor Samuel. He had set his sights on Oakfield, and no one in this town was safe. It was up to Sarah to stop him before it was too late. But with every passing moment, the danger grew, and she had no idea how far Jennings was willing to go to make his power absolute. The night had fallen hard over Oakfield, the town now shrouded in a blanket of eerie silence that matched the weight of the investigation pressing down on Sarah. As she sat in her car outside the police station, reviewing the notes on her phone, her thoughts lingered on Pastor Samuel's confession. Jennings, it seemed, was part of something far more insidious. But now the situation had escalated. There was no time left for half measures or cautious investigation. She needed to find him, and fast. The moment Pastor Samuel had revealed that Jennings was targeting everyone who'd ever crossed him, the reality of the situation became painfully clear. Kyle Jennings wasn't just a blackmailer. He was a predator, moving through Oakfield with the sole intent to dismantle anyone who had even the slightest hint of vulnerability. And Oakfield, with its carefully constructed facades of respectability, had plenty of them. With no solid leads on Jennings' whereabouts, Sarah needed to act fast. She grabbed her coat from the passenger seat and headed back inside the station to gather her team. There was no time to waste. If Jennings was truly connected to organized crime, there was no telling what lengths he would go to in order to cover his tracks. "Detective!" Jim's voice interrupted her thoughts as she entered the station. He was standing by his desk, his face lit with urgency. "I've got something you need to see." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Look at this," Jim said, handing her a stack of printouts. "I managed to get a copy of the cell phone records from Jennings's burner phone. The last calls made were to a number registered in another town, Granger. It's a small town about 90 miles from here. The number belongs to someone named Michael Rivers." Sarah's eyes narrowed. Michael Rivers. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. She quickly flipped through the papers. Rivers was tied to a series of illegal activities in the area: drug trafficking, arms deals, and a few unsolved disappearances. He was a known associate of organized crime groups operating out of larger cities. If Jennings had been in contact with Rivers, the situation had just gone from dangerous to deadly. "We need to move now," Sarah said, the urgency in her voice clear. "Prepare a team, Jim. We're heading to Granger." The drive to Granger was long and tense, with the cold night air pressing against the windows of the unmarked police vehicle. Sarah stared out at the passing landscape, her mind racing. Every instinct told her that Jennings wasn't just hiding out in Granger. He was setting something up, something that would tie up the loose ends in Oakfield and secure his place in whatever criminal operation he was involved in. The small town of Granger was a stark contrast to Oakfield, with rundown buildings and empty streets giving it a forgotten, desolate feel. Sarah's headlights cut through the darkness as she approached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was secluded, surrounded by trees, and located far enough from the center of town to avoid any attention. It was exactly the kind of place where someone like Kyle Jennings would lay low. She turned to her team, which had arrived alongside her, and gave a quick nod. "We go in silent. No one makes a move unless I say so." The team disembarked from the car, moving quietly. Toward the warehouse, the cold air was thick with tension, and Sarah's every sense was on high alert. As they neared the entrance, she signaled for everyone to stop and listen. Faint voices echoed from within the warehouse, distorted by the walls, but unmistakable. Jennings was inside. "Stay close," Sarah whispered, her hand gripping her gun. "And remember, we're looking for Jennings and anyone else who might be with him. This is a potential bust for organized crime. Be ready for anything." They crept to the side of the building, searching for an entry point. The warehouse door was ajar, and the creak of it moving in the wind sent a chill through Sarah's spine. She peered inside, scanning the dark interior. Stacks of crates and metal shelves loomed in the shadows. But there, in the dim light, she could make out two figures talking. "Stay here," Sarah whispered to her team. "I'll move ahead." She slipped inside, careful not to make a sound, keeping to the shadows as she crept closer. The voices grew clearer as she neared. She could now hear the distinct sound of Jennings's voice, sharp and demanding. "You don't understand, Michael," Jennings was saying. his tone low and clipped. I've got everything I need now. All the footage, all the leverage. I'm going to burn them all. Samuel, Amanda, Robert, they'll pay for crossing me. And once I'm done with Oakfield, we're moving on to the next town. Bigger things, bigger stakes. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Jennings wasn't just here to lay low. He was orchestrating his next move, the one that would see Oakfield's darkest secrets revealed and exposed to the public. He wasn't just trying to destroy people's lives. He was building something much bigger. Blackmail, extortion, and possibly even murder. He was creating a criminal empire piece by piece, using the people of Oakfield as his pawns. She tightened her grip on her gun. It was time to act. With a swift motion, Sarah darted into the room, gun raised and pointed directly at Jennings. Kyle Jennings, police! Drop the weapon! Jennings froze, his face shifting from surprise to a twisted smirk. You think you've won, detective? He sneered, slowly raising his hands. You think you're going to stop me? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Sarah motioned for her team to advance, their guns also drawn. You're under arrest for extortion, blackmail, and involvement in organized crime. Don't move. But Jennings wasn't done. His hand darted toward a metal crate near him, and before Sarah could react, a blinding flash of light filled the room. An explosion tore through the warehouse, knocking everyone off their feet and sending a wave of heat and debris crashing into them. The world spun out of control. Sarah's head slammed against the concrete floor, and for a moment, everything went dark. When Sarah regained consciousness, the smell of smoke filled the air. Her ears rang, and her vision was blurry, but she could make out the figures of her team, groaning as they staggered to their feet. The explosion had thrown them all off balance, but miraculously, none of them were seriously hurt. Sarah pushed herself up, her head throbbing. She could hear Jennings's voice in the distance, shouting orders to someone. He was still alive and still trying to escape. Stay with me, she barked to her team. Jennings is still in there. We can't let him get away. They moved forward cautiously, the warehouse now a maze of fire and smoke. The team split up, clearing rooms, checking every possible exit. But as Sarah turned a corner, she spotted him. Jennings was running, his hand clutching a small device in his palm. He saw her coming, and with a wicked grin, he slammed a button on the device, triggering a second explosion. But Sarah was ready. With a swift move, she tackled him to the ground, knocking the device from his hand just before the explosion could detonate. I'm not done, he hissed through gritted teeth, struggling beneath her. You can't stop me. But it was over. Within seconds, Sarah's team closed in, handcuffing Jennings and dragging him to his feet. His defiance faltered as they read him his rights, and he realized that the game was up. As Jennings was hauled away, Sarah looked around at the chaos, the fire now under control, the wreckage of the warehouse, the shattered pieces of Oakfield's quiet facade. She had stopped Jennings, but the scars he left would take a long time to heal. Sarah stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She had found him. She had brought him down. But the town of Oakfield had been changed forever. And with that, Sarah Lawson knew that the fight was far from over. There were still more secrets to uncover, more people to protect. But for now, the darkness had been pushed back, at least for a little while.